They destroyed every single one of her pies. The whole town watched, and not one person moved a muscle. Summer, 1883. A 39-year-old widow stands alone in the middle of a dusty market street, hands trembling, dress streaked with mud, watching 11 peach pies, nearly 2 weeks of sleepless labor, shatter across the dirt while the crowd does nothing but stare and laugh. They have already decided who she is, a fat widow who can't pay her debts, a woman who should have known her place and stayed in it. But then a stranger steps forward. No shouting, no threats. Just a man who walks calmly through the wreckage, looks the bully dead in the eye, and refuses to move. What happens next will change everything. Not just for Edith Barrett, but for every person in that town who chose to look away. If this story finds you today, hit like, drop the name of the city where you're watching in the comments. I want to see how far this has traveled. And stay until the very end, because the woman they tried to destroy is about to become the last thing they ever expected. The most dangerous person in any room is the one who has nothing left to lose and everything left to prove. This is her story. The peaches had been perfect that year. Edith Barrett noticed it the morning she climbed the old ladder behind the house for the first time since Thomas died. The way the fruit hung low and heavy on the branches, skin flushed deep amber and rose, almost too ripe, almost embarrassingly abundant, as though the tree itself had decided to offer something generous in a season when the world had offered her nothing but loss. She stood at the base of that ladder for a long moment before she climbed it, not because of the height. Edith Barrett had never been afraid of heights. She stood there because the last time she had picked peaches from this tree, Thomas had been standing below her, one big hand resting lightly on the ladder's side. Not holding it, not fussing, just there, the way he was always just there, steady and warm and certain. Now the ladder stood alone. And so did she. Get up, Edith. She heard the voice in her own chest, not from anywhere outside of it. There's work to do. She climbed, she picked, and by the time the morning heat had burned the dew from the grass, she had filled 3 bushel baskets with the most beautiful peaches she had ever seen in her 40 years of living on this dry, stubborn stretch of Texas earth. The idea came to her that same evening while she sat at the kitchen table staring at a letter she had already read 6 times. Final notice of foreclosure proceedings. The words were printed in clean, official type that felt almost insulting in its neatness, as though the bank had wanted to make it clear that what they were doing to her was orderly, professional, nothing personal. 47 days. That was all she had left before Halverson's First Territorial Bank would legally seize the Barrett Bakery, the building Thomas had built by hand, board by board, the summer they were married. The oven he had mortared himself. The sign above the door that still read Barrett and Company, fine baked goods in the faded script he had painted with a child's brush because they couldn't afford a proper sign maker. 47 days and a letter that smelled like cedar chips and cold intent. Edith folded the letter, looked at the peaches, looked back at the letter. Then she stood up, put on her apron, and started baking. It took her 11 days, not 11 days of baking. The actual baking came at the end, in a fierce 4-day stretch where she barely slept, where the kitchen ran so hot that she kept the back door propped open with a flat iron and worked in her shift sleeves, her dark hair pinned back with 2 pencils because she kept forgetting where she'd put her hairpins. 11 days of preparation, of candying the ginger, of rendering the lard just right, of testing the crust recipe 3 times until it held its crimp through a full oven cycle without shrinking. 11 days of deciding that if she was going to stand in the Millhaven market and ask the town to buy her work, she was going to give them something worth buying. The pies came out of the oven on a Thursday morning, one after another, their lattice tops golden brown and steaming, the peach filling running just slightly at the edges in a way that looked almost intentional, like the fruit was trying to escape its own beauty. Edith lined them up on the long kitchen table and stood back and looked at them. She allowed herself exactly 1 moment of pride. Then she started wrapping them in cheesecloth. Her neighbor, old Agnes Pruitt, came by while she was loading the wagon. 11 pies, Agnes said, leaning on the fence post with her pipe clamped between her teeth. You taking them all to market? I am. By yourself? Thomas isn't available, Edith said without bitterness. It was simply true. Agnes was quiet for a moment, watching her lift the last crate into the wagon bed. Then, people in this town haven't been kind to you, Edith. Not since the funeral. I know it. Halverson's got friends at that market. I know that too. Agnes took a long pull on her pipe and blew smoke at the cloudless sky. You're a stubborn woman. Yes, Edith said, climbing up to the wagon seat and gathering the reins. Thomas used to say it was my best quality. She paused. He was the only one who thought so. She clicked her tongue at the old mare and rolled out of the yard, 11 pies in the back and 47 days of time left in the world, and she did not let herself look back at the house because she knew if she did, she would see the empty front porch, and she was not ready for that yet. The Millhaven Summer Market ran every Saturday along the main street, stretching from the grain exchange at the north end down to the livery stable at the south, a long corridor of canvas stalls and wooden tables, and the particular smell of a western town in August. Horses and dust and frying fat, and something sweet underneath it all, like hope trying to survive the heat. Edith arrived early. She had learned as a young woman that arriving early to a market meant you got to choose your table placement, and table placement mattered. It was the difference between being seen and being overlooked. She set up near the intersection of First and Market, where foot traffic turned and slowed, and people naturally paused to get their bearings. She arranged the pies carefully, removed the cheesecloth, set out her little handwritten sign, peach lattice, 35 cents each, Barrett Bakery, in Thomas's hand, copied from an old receipt book because she thought his handwriting was steadier than hers, and she wanted steadiness today. And then she waited. The first hour was fine. Quiet, but fine. People walked by, glanced, kept walking. A few stopped to look. One woman, Marta Engel, who ran the dress shop, picked up a pie, sniffed it appreciatively, then set it back down without meeting Edith's eyes and moved on. Edith said nothing. She knew what was happening. The town had made up its mind about her after Thomas died, or rather, after the rumors started. Halverson's people had been careful about that. The bakery's failing. She can't manage it alone. Poor things in over her head. The whispers had started within weeks of the funeral, quiet and persistent, and designed to undermine her credit before she'd even had a chance to grieve. By the time the morning sun had climbed to its full height, Edith had sold 2 pies, one to a traveling merchant who didn't know her, and one to the widow Castellano, who bought it with her eyes bright and fierce, like an act of small defiance. 9 pies remained on the table. The day was burning. She heard him before she saw him. The voice carried, not loud but certain, with the particular resonance of a man who was accustomed to filling space without effort. "Get out of my way, Deaver. You're blocking the whole street." A laugh, mean and short. "Settle down, boss. Just looking at the fat widow's pies." Edith's hands went still on the table. She had seen Wade Deaver before. Everyone in Millhaven had seen Wade Deaver, Wasi. He was the kind of man who made himself visible, who occupied rooms and sidewalks and conversations with a physical aggression that stopped just short of being actionable. He was Gideon Crow's ranch foreman, which in Millhaven meant he was Gideon Crow's instrument, the edge of the blade that Crow himself never had to touch directly. Deaver was a big man, broad through the shoulders, with a face that might have been handsome once and had curdled into something meaner over the years. He wore his authority like a second coat, always just slightly too warm for the weather. Behind him came 2 of his riders, and behind them, because Wade Deaver never went anywhere without an audience, came a loose scatter of townspeople who had stopped to watch whatever was about to happen. He stopped in front of her table. He looked at the pies. He looked at her. Something cold moved through his expression. 35 cents, he said. That's what you think these are worth? That's the price, Edith said. Her voice came out steady. She was grateful for that. Awful ambitious for a woman who can't pay her mortgage. He said it loud enough for the gathering crowd to hear. A few people laughed. Most of them just watched. Edith kept her hands flat on the table. Would you like to buy one, Mr. Deaver? Buy one. He said it like it was funny. No, I don't think I would. He picked up the pie nearest him, the largest one, the one with the most perfect crust, the one she'd been most proud of, and turned it over in his hands, studying it with a mockery of close attention. I think maybe I'd like to see if they're worth 35 cents first. Please put that down. Or what? He looked at her with a flat reptilian calm. You gonna make me? The pie hit the ground. Not dropped. Thrown, with a precise downward snap of the wrist. The crust shattered. Peach filling spread dark and gleaming across the packed dirt. The cheesecloth settled over it like a small white flag. Edith did not move. She did not speak. She stood very still because she knew, with the particular knowledge of a woman who has survived more than most people will ever understand, that moving too quickly right now would give him what he wanted, which was a reaction, a flinch, some proof that she could be broken. Around her, the crowd watched. No one stepped forward. A few people looked away. Deaver reached for the second pie. Set it down. 2 words. Quiet. Almost conversational. But something in the quality of the silence that followed them was different from the silence that had preceded them. Heavier, charged, the way air feels before lightning. Edith looked past Deaver's shoulder. The man standing 20 feet away was perhaps 40 years old, lean without being thin, with the kind of stillness about him that didn't come from calm so much as from certainty, like a man who had decided a long time ago that most things people got upset about weren't worth raising his voice for. He wore a good coat, trail dusty but well cut, and a hat that had been expensive once. His eyes, dark and steady, were fixed on Wade Deaver with an expression that Edith couldn't quite read. Not anger, exactly. Something more careful than that, more deliberate. She didn't know him. Deaver turned slowly, the second pie still in his hand. Mr. Mercer. The foreman's voice had changed, not retreated exactly, but rearranged. Didn't expect to see you at market today. Put the pie down, Wade. We're just having a conversation. No. The man named Mercer took 2 unhurried steps forward. You destroyed a woman's property in front of 40 people and laughed about it. That's not a conversation. Put the pie down. Something shifted in the crowd. Edith felt it rather than saw it. A collective adjustment of weight and breath, like people taking a half step back to give the space more room. Deaver's jaw tightened. He glanced around at his riders, then at the watching townspeople, calculating something. Then he set the pie down. Hard enough to crack the crust, but set it down. This isn't your business, Mercer. I'm making it my business. Mercer reached the table and stopped beside it, not between Deaver and Edith exactly, but close enough that the geometry of the moment had shifted. And you're going to clean that up? He nodded at the broken pie on the ground. The silence was absolute. I'm going to... Deaver started. Yes, Mercer said simply. You are. What happened next was the thing Edith would think about for weeks afterward, the thing she would turn over in her mind late at night when she couldn't sleep. Wade Deaver, who had never in his adult life, as far as anyone in Millhaven could recall, bent to anyone below Gideon Crow himself, crouched down, picked up the pieces of broken crust, gathered them in his hat, and stood. His face was a controlled mask of fury, but he did it. Now pay for it, Mercer said. Deaver reached into his coat, threw coins onto the table, enough for 2 pies, more than enough, without looking at Edith. Then he turned and walked, his riders falling in behind him, and the crowd parted to let them pass and then stood there looking uncertain, like people who'd expected a fire and gotten a sunrise instead. Caleb Mercer turned to Edith. Up close, there were lines around his eyes that hadn't been visible from a distance. Not the lines of age exactly, but of attention, of a man who spent a great deal of time looking carefully at things. There was something in his face that reminded her of the way certain horses looked just before a storm. Not afraid, but aware, completely aware, processing information that other creatures hadn't registered yet. Are you all right? He asked. It was such a plain question. Not, what a terrible thing, you poor woman, and not, don't let men like that trouble you. Just the direct, simple question. Are you all right? Asked like he actually wanted to know the answer. Yes, she said. Then, more honestly, I've been better. Something shifted briefly in his expression. Not quite a smile, but near it. I'd like to buy your pies, he said. Edith looked at the remaining 9 on her table, the broken ones on the ground, the money Deaver had thrown. The whole lot, Mercer said, including the ones he broke, full price. The broken ones aren't worth, they're worth what you baked them to be worth. He said it simply, without making it into an argument. The fact that someone else destroyed them doesn't change what they cost you to make. Edith looked at him for a long moment. Around them, the market was slowly resuming its noise, the crowd dispersing, conversations restarting with the nervous energy of people processing something they'd witnessed and weren't quite sure how to categorize. "Why?" she asked. "Why what? Why did you do that?" "Deaver works for Crow. You've made an enemy today for a woman you've never met." Mercer was quiet for a moment. He reached into his coat, counted out bills and coins onto the table with unhurried care. "No honest work should end in humiliation," he said. "That's all." He wrapped the 9 remaining pies himself, carefully, in the cheesecloth she handed him, and loaded them into his saddlebag with a deliberateness that suggested he had done careful physical work before and didn't consider it beneath him. Then he paused. "I have a ranch," he said, "about 6 miles east. I need someone who can manage a kitchen, a large one. 20 people, sometimes more depending on the season." He held her gaze. "The position pays fair wages and includes a room. The work is honest." Edith stared at him. "You don't know me." "I know your pies," he said, "and I know what I just watched you do." A pause. "Most people, when Deaver goes after them like that, they leave. You stood there. You kept your hands flat on the table, and you didn't give him an inch." He picked up his hat. "I'd rather work with someone like that than someone who folds." He touched the brim of his hat, swung up onto his horse in one easy motion, and rode east down the main street without looking back. Edith stood at her table in the August heat with 11 pies worth of money in her hand and watched him go, and felt for the first time in almost 2 years something she couldn't immediately name, something quiet and tentative and cautious, like a flame being cupped against the wind. She thought it might be possibility. That night, she sat at the kitchen table again with the foreclosure letter unfolded before her and the lamp burning low. She counted the money twice. It wasn't enough, not nearly enough to save the bakery on its own, but it was something, and something was more than she'd had that morning. She thought about Caleb Mercer's face, the steadiness of him, the way he had spoken to Deaver not with bravado but with authority, the kind that didn't need volume. No honest work should end in humiliation. She turned the phrase over in her mind like a smooth stone, examining it from different angles. There was nothing sentimental about it, nothing preachy. It was just a statement of principle, said by a man who seemed to operate from principles rather than performances. She thought about what Agnes had said. People in this town haven't been kind to you. This was true. Since Thomas died, she had been slowly, methodically edged out of the life of Millhaven. Not with cruelty exactly, more with omission. The invitations that stopped coming, the credit at the dry goods store that had quietly been reduced, the way women who had been friendly at church now smiled a little too carefully when they passed her on the street, as though they'd been warned about something, as though she were a warning herself of what could happen to a woman alone. She had told herself it didn't matter. She had told herself she only needed to keep the bakery running, keep Thomas's work alive, keep the doors open. But the doors were about to close. Edith folded the letter, set it to one side. Then she pulled a fresh piece of paper toward her and wrote, in her own clear, unornamental hand, "Mr. Mercer, I will come Tuesday. E. Barrett." She blotted it, folded it, and went to bed for the first time in weeks without lying awake until the lamp burned dry. The morning before she went, she stood at Thomas's grave and told him about it. She wasn't sure why. She was not a woman who talked to the dead as a habit, thought it was not something she judged in others. But she had things to say that she needed to hear herself say out loud, and Thomas had always been the best listener she'd known. "I think something is happening," she said. "I don't know what yet, but I'm going to find out." She looked at the simple marker, his name and dates cut clean into the limestone. "I know you would have had opinions about it. You always had opinions about everything." A pause. "I think you would have liked him. He reminded me a little of you, the way he stood, like he had already decided what kind of man he was going to be and wasn't interested in negotiating." She fixed the small bunch of prairie flowers she'd brought against the base of the stone, stood. "I'm not going to stop," she said. "I know you'd want me to know that. I'm not stopping." She rode east toward the Mercer Ranch as the morning light came in long and copper across the flats, and the wind smelled of dry grass and coming change, and Edith Barrett held the reins steady in her hands and looked forward and did not look back. 6 miles east, past a dry creek bed, and through a stand of cottonwood that shivered silver in the breeze, a gate appeared. Simple, iron-hinged, with no name above it, which she thought was unusual for a property that clearly had some scale to it. The drive beyond the gate ran long and straight to a cluster of buildings. A main house of whitewashed timber, a long bunkhouse, a barn, several outbuildings. Everything looked maintained but not prosperous. The buildings were in good repair, but there was a purposefulness to the layout that suggested the place had been built for function rather than impression. What she noticed first, though, were the women. There were 3 of them visible as she pulled into the yard. One carrying a bucket from the well, one hanging wash on a line strung between 2 posts, one sitting on the steps of what looked like a small stone building, reading. They looked at Edith with curiosity but not alarm. The one at the well raised a hand in greeting. This was not what she had expected. Edith sat in her wagon for a moment, taking it in, rearranging her assumptions. "Mrs. Barrett." Caleb Mercer came around the side of the barn, hat off, shielding his eyes against the morning sun. He was in work clothes, not the dusty coat from Saturday, but canvas trousers and a collarless shirt, his sleeves rolled to the elbow. He looked more at home than he had in town. Easier, somehow. "Mr. Mercer," she said. "You came." "I said I would." He helped her down from the wagon with a courtesy that was matter-of-fact rather than ceremonial, and led her toward the main house without preamble. "I'll show you the kitchen. The women, there are 7 of them currently, they have their own arrangements for meals, but the kitchen itself has been neglected since my housekeeper left in the spring. It needs someone who knows what they're doing." "What happened to your housekeeper?" A pause. Brief, but she caught it. "Her husband came back," he said, in a tone that told her not to ask more. She didn't ask more, but she filed it away. The kitchen was at the back of the main house, large and well-equipped. A proper iron range, stone countertops, a wood box beside the door that was empty, and shelves that held a jumbled collection of supplies, arranged with what she could only describe as masculine confidence. Everything roughly in the right place, nothing labeled, order implied, but not enforced. She walked the length of it slowly, opening the oven door, checking the flue, testing the counter with her palm. "The range draws well," she said. "The flour's been stored wrong. It needs to come off the floor or you'll lose it to damp. Your salt is fine, but your baking powder is old." She opened a tin and sniffed. "Very old. Probably not active anymore." "I'll get more," he said. "You'll need to know the schedule of the people eating. How many, at what times, any particular needs." She turned to face him. "I don't cook for crowds the way I cook for a bakery, but I can learn the rhythm of a place if you'll tell me what it needs." "I will," he said. He was watching her in that careful way he had, like he was listening to more than the words. "And the women," she said. "Who are they?" He leaned against the doorframe. "People who needed somewhere to be," he said. "That's the honest answer. The longer answer takes more time than this morning." "Tell me the longer answer." He looked at her. Something shifted in his expression. Not surprise exactly, but recalibration. As if he'd expected her to accept the short answer and was adjusting to the fact that she hadn't. "Over supper," he said. Edith turned back to the kitchen, surveying it with the critical proprietary eye of a woman who already knew she was going to fix it. "Fine," she said, "but tonight I need proper baking powder and someone to split wood for that box." "Done," he said. She pulled on her apron. She got to work. And in the kitchen of a ranch 6 miles east of everything she had known, with the smell of old flour and new possibilities, Edith Barrett began to understand that the woman who had walked into the Millhaven market with 11 pies and walked out with something she couldn't yet name, that woman had not yet discovered the full weight of what she was carrying. The battle ahead was older than she knew. The stakes were higher than she'd imagined. And the man leaning in the doorframe, watching her work with those careful, storm-reading eyes, knew both of those things already. He had been waiting, it turned out, for quite some time. The kitchen, Edith decided by the end of her first week, was not merely a kitchen. It was a nerve center. It was the place where the ranch breathed in and breathed out, where the women came in the early mornings with their hands still cold from the pump, pulling up stools to the long prep table while the range warmed, wrapping their fingers around tin cups of coffee that Edith had started making strong enough to stand a spoon in, where the hired men knocked on the back door at noon with their hats in their hands and their boots scraped clean out of some instinctive respect that she hadn't asked for and quietly accepted. Where Caleb Mercer himself appeared each evening at the same hour, sat at the end of the table farthest from the stove, and drank his coffee in a silence that was never uncomfortable but always full. The silence of a man with a great deal on his mind who had decided that supper was not the place to carry it. She had learned a few things about him in that first week. That he had owned the ranch for 11 years but had not grown up in this territory. There was something in the way he spoke about the land, a precision that suggested study rather than inheritance. That he slept less than most people because she heard him moving through the house in the hours before dawn. Careful and quiet, but not quiet enough for a woman who'd spent 2 years sleeping lightly. That he was respected in certain rooms and feared in others, and that he seemed to prefer the former and accept the latter as an occupational reality. She had not yet learned why there were women on his ranch who had nowhere else to go, but she was beginning to understand the shape of the answer, the way you can sometimes understand the shape of a room from the light coming under its door. The women themselves were teaching her, if not in words, then in the particular language of shared work and proximity. There was Clara, 26, who had arrived 8 months ago with a bruised collarbone and a 4-year-old son named Patch, who had his mother's dark eyes and his father's apparent absence. There was Nora, older, somewhere near 50, who had the bearing of a woman who'd once had more and carried the memory of it like a compass needle, always oriented toward some north she was working back toward. There was young Jessie, barely 18, quick with numbers and quicker with her tongue, who had somehow ended up doing the ranch's bookkeeping with an accuracy that made the previous ledger keeper look like he'd been counting on his fingers. They did not tell Edith their stories directly. That was not how it worked in a place like this. But they told her other things, where the sugar was, which floorboard creaked, that the brown mare in the east paddock had a tendency to spook at shadows, and the accumulation of small practical knowledge was its own kind of welcome. It was Clara who first said anything that mattered. They were snapping beans together on the back porch one evening, the two of them working in comfortable parallel while Patch slept inside, when Clara said, without looking up from her work, "Mr. Mercer doesn't take anything from the ranch for himself. Did you know that?" Edith kept snapping. "What do you mean?" "I mean the wages he pays. Mine, Nora's, Jessie's, everyone's. They come out of the ranch's operating accounts. But his personal expenses, what he spends on himself, the trips into town, his own food and clothes, he keeps that separate, pays it out of a private fund." Clara paused. "Jessie found it in the ledger. It's been that way since he opened this place." Edith thought about the coat he wore. Good quality, but not new. The office she'd glimpsed once through an open door. Bookshelves covering 2 walls, a desk buried in papers, nothing decorative, nothing that wasn't useful. "He's not wealthy," she said slowly. "He's not poor either," Clara said, "but he's not getting rich off us, if that's what you're wondering." She glanced sideways at Edith. "I know what you're wondering. We all did, at the start. Wondered what he wanted, what the price was going to be." She looked back at her beans. There wasn't one. There still isn't. That's the part that took me the longest to believe. Edith turned this over in her mind the way she'd turned over his words at the market. Carefully. Looking for a seam. Some place where the surface didn't match what was underneath. She didn't find one. Which didn't mean it wasn't there. But it made her fractionally less careful when he appeared at the kitchen door that evening, and she told him that the wagon needed its left rear wheel checked before she'd take it out on the county road, and he nodded and said he'd have it seen to in the morning, and that was all. That was the whole conversation. 2 practical people exchanging practical information. And yet when he left, she found herself standing at the window watching him cross the yard in the last light, and she thought, "Who are you, Caleb Mercer, and what is it that you're building here?" She didn't have to wait long for the first answer to something, though it was not the answer she'd been looking for. The wagon wheel had not been fixed by morning. This was not Caleb's failure. He had told the young hand, Robbie, to see to it, and Robbie was generally reliable, but Robbie had been sent to the south pasture before dawn for reasons that hadn't been communicated down the chain, and so when Edith climbed up to the wagon seat on Wednesday morning with a list of supplies and the intention of making the 8-mile drive to the dry goods store, the left rear wheel was exactly as she had left it, worn at the hub in a way that would probably hold, but probably was not a word Edith had ever been comfortable building plans around. She stood in the yard and looked at it. She thought about the supply list, baking powder being genuinely urgent now, and the salt nearly out. And she'd promised Patch a paper of candy from the store because he'd helped her carry wood without being asked, and had done it seriously, with an air of great professional responsibility, that she'd found unexpectedly moving. She climbed up to the seat. She'd driven worse wheels on worse roads for longer distances in her life. The road east toward Millhaven ran along the ridge of a gentle slope before dipping down toward the creek crossing at Carpenter's Ford. Not a dramatic crossing in dry season, maybe 3 feet of water over smooth, flat rock. But the road narrowed there and the banks were steep on the far side, a rise of maybe 8 feet up a gravel incline with a sharp turn at the top. She was halfway up that incline when the wheel gave. Not all at once. It was more like a conversation that went wrong gradually. First a sound, a low grinding protest that she felt in her palms through the reins before she heard it. Then a lurch, a sideways pull that the mare felt and didn't like, tossing her head and dancing left. Then the moment, just a fraction of a second, but long in the way that moments of danger always stretch. When Edith understood simultaneously that the wheel was collapsing and that the mare was going to bolt, and that the left side of the wagon was angling toward the creek bank, and that she had no good options, she dropped the reins and grabbed the brake with both hands. The mare bolted anyway. What came next happened fast and in pieces that she would later only be able to reassemble partially. The wagon lurching hard left, her own weight shifting with it. The brake doing something but not enough. The mare screaming. Horses screamed in a way you didn't forget. The gravel bank giving way under the left wheels in a long grinding rush, and then a hand. A hand closing on her arm with a grip that had no hesitation in it. The momentum was still carrying the wagon, still carrying her. But the hand didn't let go, and there was a horse beside hers, close enough that she could hear it breathing, and then she was no longer in the seat. She was in the air for one vertiginous instant, and then she was on the far bank with her feet on solid ground, and her heart somewhere in the vicinity of her throat. The wagon stopped against a stand of scrub oak 10 feet down the bank. The mare stood trembling in the traces, neck dark with sweat, but unhurt. Edith turned. Caleb Mercer sat his horse on the bank above, his own horse blowing hard, his hat gone. He was looking at her with an expression she couldn't fully parse, not the relief she might have expected, something more controlled than that, as though he had run the calculation while it was happening and was now checking the result. "Are you hurt?" he asked. She inventoried herself rapidly. "No." She looked down at her arm where his hand had been. She would have a bruise there, she thought. She didn't mind. "The wheel," she started. "I know." His jaw tightened briefly. "I should have checked it myself." "You told Robbie." "I should have checked it myself," he said again. Not as an apology exactly, more like a man updating an internal standard. He swung down from his horse and came down the bank, moving with a sureness on loose gravel that suggested he'd moved on uncertain ground before. He checked the mare first, running his hands down her legs with a practiced efficiency. Then the wagon. He crouched by the collapsed wheel, examined it, stood. "Axles intact," he said. "I can have this back up the bank in an hour with the right tools." He looked at her. "I'll get you a better wagon for the supply run, or I can go myself." "I'll go," Edith said. He looked like he wanted to say something else. He didn't. He respected, she was beginning to learn, the word "I" when she used it with finality. "Then ride," he said. He gestured to his horse. "He won't throw you." "I can ride," she said. "I know you can," he said, simply. And somehow it wasn't condescending. It was just an acknowledgement of a fact he'd observed and filed. She can ride. Noted. Moving on. She took the horse. She rode to town. She got the baking powder and the salt and the paper of candy for Patch. And when she came back, the wagon was up the bank, wheel replaced with a solid spare. And Caleb Mercer was still there, stacking the tools. And he looked up when she rode in and said nothing at all, just watched her dismount with that careful, storm-reading attention, and she handed him his reins and said "thank you," and meant it more than the words could hold. The poisoning came 4 days later. Edith noticed it first, and she would never be entirely sure afterward what had alerted her. Whether it was the smell, which was wrong in a way she couldn't immediately specify, the faint off note in the flour barrel she'd opened that morning, or whether it was something older and less definable. Some accumulated sense from years of working with food that had developed a sensitivity to things that weren't quite right. She'd been preparing to start the morning bread, 8 loaves, standard morning routine by now, when she lifted the lid off the large flour crock and stood there for a moment, not moving, smelling. She put the lid back on. She walked to the small building where the ranch's dry stores were kept and went through every container methodically, moving slowly, opening each one, closing it again. The flour? Wrong. The cornmeal? Wrong. The salt. She wasn't sure, but she set it aside. The sugar? Fine. The coffee? Fine. The lard? Wrong. She walked back to the kitchen and stood very still for a moment, working through the arithmetic of it. How much food had come out of those stores in the last day? Who had eaten it? Then she went and found Caleb. He was in the barn with Robbie, going over something with the harness. He looked up when she appeared in the doorway, and something in her face, she didn't try to arrange it, there wasn't time, must have told him immediately that this was not a routine interruption, because he was already moving toward her before she'd said a word. The flour and the lard and probably the cornmeal have been contaminated, she said quietly, so Robbie wouldn't hear. Something's in them. I don't know what, but I'd want everyone who ate breakfast this morning accounted for. He didn't ask her if she was sure. He didn't say that seems unlikely or are you certain or any of the other things men said when women brought them information they found inconvenient. He simply turned and said, Robbie, go find Clara and ask her to account for everyone at the ranch and meet me at the main house in 10 minutes. And then he turned back to Edith. Show me. She showed him. He looked at each container with the same focused attention he brought to everything, and she watched his expression shift through something. Not surprise, she thought. More like confirmation, like a piece had landed where he'd half expected it to land. Caleb, she said, and it was the first time she'd used his given name, and they both noticed it, a brief pause in the air between them. You don't look surprised. He put the lid back on the cornmeal crock, set it carefully to one side. No, he said. He looked at her steadily. I'm not. Then what is this? He was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that wasn't evasion but consideration, deciding how much to say, she thought, and in what order. Someone got onto this property last night, he said finally. I've had people watching, but they know the blind spots. They've been probing those blind spots for the past month. Edith felt something cold move through her that had nothing to do with the temperature of the storage room. Who is they? He looked at her, and in his expression there was something she hadn't seen there before, a kind of exhausted honesty, like a man setting down something very heavy. People who want this ranch to fail, he said, and who are running out of more subtle methods. That evening, after Caleb had personally verified that everyone at the ranch was well, no one had eaten from the contaminated stores, as it turned out, because breakfast had been coffee and yesterday's cornbread, which came from different supplies. He sat at the kitchen table and told her some of it, not all of it. She understood even then that there were layers to what he was carrying, and that he would give her what he judged she needed to know in an order that he'd probably been thinking about for longer than she'd been here. But he told her enough. There's a man named Gideon Crow, he said. I know who Gideon Crow is, Edith said. Everyone in 3 counties knows who Gideon Crow is. Then you know he owns the Halverson Bank. She went still. I knew they had an arrangement. I didn't know he owned it. It's not publicly known, Caleb said. Halverson is the face. Crow is the architecture. He turned his coffee cup in his hands, a habit she'd noticed, something he did when he was choosing his words. The foreclosure they've started on your bakery. It's not about the mortgage, Edith. It's about the building. The bakery sits on a parcel that connects 2 properties Crow wants consolidated. He's been acquiring land along that corridor for 4 years, and your building is the last piece he needs. The room was very quiet. Outside, the night insects had started their work, and somewhere in the distance, one of the horses shifted in its stall. Thomas, she said, very carefully. Thomas's death. She looked at him. He wasn't sick. I always told people he wasn't sick, that a healthy man of 43 doesn't simply go to bed one night, and I know, Caleb said. Just those 2 words. But the way he said them, with a weight that suggested they weren't simply sympathetic, that they were knowing, made her hands go cold. How long have you known? She asked. Long enough, he said. that I've had investigators working on it for 2 years, and long enough that when I saw you standing at that market table with 11 peach pies and Wade Deaver coming for you, I understood that what was about to happen was not random. Edith looked at him across the table, this man she'd known for less than 2 weeks, this careful, storm-reading man who had appeared at the right moment twice now, and who, she was beginning to understand, had not simply appeared by accident either time. "You were there on purpose," she said. "At the market." He didn't look away. "I was there because I'd heard you were bringing pies to market, and I'd heard that Crow had told Deaver to make an example." A pause. "I should have intervened sooner. I waited to see if anyone else would." His jaw tightened. "No one did." "No," she said. "No one did." They sat with that for a moment. The plain, unvarnished ugliness of it. The crowd that had watched and stepped back and let it happen. And Edith felt something shift inside her, some last protective instinct toward the town she'd grown up adjacent to, releasing. "What are you building here?" she asked. "The ranch, the women, the investigators? What are you actually building?" Caleb looked at her steadily. "A case," he said. "I've been building a legal case against Gideon Crow for 4 years. I have records, witnesses, documents. What I don't have yet is someone willing to stand up in public and carry it." He set down his cup. "Crow's people have been systematically terrifying every potential witness or complainant into silence. That's what the sabotage is, like, not an attempt to destroy this ranch. An attempt to make everyone here afraid enough to leave before I can—" He stopped. "Before you can what?" she asked. "Before I can find the right person," he said. The silence that followed was long, and during it Edith Barrett sat very still and looked at this man across the table and understood, with the particular clarity that comes sometimes in the dead center of things, that she was looking at the other half of something. Not a rescue, not a shelter, a partnership that hadn't declared itself yet. She did not say this. She picked up her coffee cup and drank the last of it, which had gone cold, and set it down. "You'll need more baking powder by Thursday," she said, "and I want better locks on the storeroom." "Done," he said. She stood. She untied her apron. She looked at him once more, and then she said with a steadiness that surprised even herself, "I'm not going anywhere, Caleb." He looked up at her. "I want you to know that," she said. "Whatever they're trying to do, the wagon, the stores, whatever comes next, I'm not going anywhere." Something moved through his expression, deep and brief, like a change of weather seen from very far away. "I know," he said. She went to bed. She did not lie awake. And outside, in the darkness beyond the ranch's fence line, someone who had been watching the lit kitchen window turned and rode away, back toward Millhaven, back toward whatever arrangements Gideon Crow was already making for the next attempt, not knowing yet that the woman who had come to this ranch expecting a kitchen job had just decided something far more consequential than whether she would stay. She had decided to fight. The stone building at the east end of the ranch yard, the one Edith had noticed on her first morning, the one where she'd seen the woman sitting on the steps reading, turned out to be a library. Not a library in the formal sense. There was no catalog, no organized system of acquisition, nothing that would have satisfied a librarian's sense of order. But there were books, shelves of them, running floor to ceiling along 3 walls, and between the books, and stacked on the windowsills and arranged in careful towers on the 2 reading tables were other things: ledgers, correspondence folders, rolled survey maps held with twine, newspaper clippings mounted on stiff backing paper in a way that suggested they'd been handled many times, and someone had wanted to preserve them. The room smelled of old paper and cedar oil, and something underneath both of those things. The particular smell of accumulated intention, of a room where serious work had been done over a long period of time. Caleb had not shown her this room. She found it on her own, the way she found most things at the ranch, by paying attention, by noticing which doors were never locked, but also never opened casually, by following the pattern of small habits that revealed what a place considered important. She had come in looking for a particular survey map that Caleb had mentioned at breakfast, something about the eastern fence line and a water rights question, and she'd found the map within 10 minutes. What kept her in the room another 2 hours was the journal. It was sitting on the second reading table, not hidden, Not particularly prominent, simply present among a stack of other documents as though it had been set down recently and not yet returned to its shelf. The cover was dark green leather, worn at the corners, with no name on the outside. Edith picked it up with the instinctive care of a woman who had handled books all her life, opened it to the first page, and read the date. March 4th, 1879. The handwriting was a woman's. She felt certain of that before she'd read enough to confirm it, something in the particular formation of the letters, the way the pen pressure varied with emotion in a way that male handwriting of this era and region rarely permitted itself. She read the first entry, which was brief and observational, a description of the weather, a note about the condition of the south pasture, and then the second, which was longer, and the third, which made her sit down. G came to the property line again today with 2 of his men. He did not cross it. He doesn't need to cross it to make his meaning clear. I have told C that we cannot simply absorb this indefinitely, that patience is a virtue only as long as there is time for it to work. C disagrees. C believes the law is the correct instrument and that the law requires time. I'm beginning to wonder if G knows something about the law in this county that we do not. Edith turned the pages carefully. The journal covered 4 years, from 1879 to the autumn of 1882, and in those 4 years, the woman who had written it had documented, with a precision that was almost clinical in its detail, the systematic dismantling of her community by a man she referred to throughout only as G. Property records that didn't match the original land grants. Mortgages called in early on dubious technical grounds. A man named Aldrich, who had died of a sudden illness 3 days after announcing he intended to bring a complaint to the Territorial Land Office. A woman named Bessie Farrow, whose house had burned while she was visiting family, and who had been told by the county assessor, with remarkable speed, that her land title had reverted to the bank due to an obscure clause in her late husband's mortgage. Edith read for 2 hours, and by the end of it her hands were not entirely steady. She found Clara in the yard and said quietly, "The journal on the second table in the east building. Whose is it?" Clara was silent for a moment, hanging a shirt on the line with methodical care. "That was Mrs. Mercer's," she said. "Margaret. She died 3 years ago." Edith absorbed this. "How?" "Fever," Clara said. "Real fever. Not like what happened to some of the others." She glanced at Edith with an expression that carried a great deal of complicated knowledge in it. Though by the end she was sick in other ways too, tired in ways that went deeper than her body. She smoothed the shirt against the line. She was the one who started the case. The documents, the records, the investigators. That was Margaret's idea first. Caleb continued it after she died. Clara looked at her directly. "I think it nearly broke him. I think continuing it was the only thing that kept him from being broken." That evening, Edith set the journal on the kitchen table when Caleb came in for supper. She didn't say anything. She just set it there and waited. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he pulled out his chair and sat down. "You found the east building," he said. "You didn't lock it." "No," he said. "I never lock it." He looked up at her. Margaret didn't believe in locking things that needed to be found. Edith sat across from him. The lamp between them threw a warm, unsteady light across both their faces. "She documented everything," she said. "She was meticulous," he said, and his voice carried in it something worn smooth by handling, grief that had been lived with long enough to become simply a condition of the world, present in everything but no longer sharp. She grew up in a family of lawyers. She knew what evidence looked like, and she knew how to build it. A pause. She also knew that evidence isn't enough on its own. You need someone to carry it into a room and stand behind it. "She didn't get that chance," Edith said. "She was going to," he said. She had identified a sympathetic judge in the territory, a federal circuit judge named Beaumont, who had already ruled against Crow's interests once on a water rights case. She was writing her formal complaint when she got sick. He was quiet for a moment. She died with the pen on her desk. The night insects had started outside. Somewhere in the bunkhouse, someone was playing a harmonica softly, something slow and without a recognizable melody, just notes finding their way through the dark. "Tell me about Gideon Crow," Edith said. "All of it. Not what you think I need to know. All of it." He looked at her across the table and she held his gaze, and after a moment he began. Gideon Crow had arrived in the territory in 1871 with enough capital to buy a modest cattle operation and enough intelligence to understand that in a growing territory, the real wealth wasn't in cattle. It was in land, and more specifically, in the instruments that controlled land, the banks that held mortgages, the county offices that recorded deeds, the assessors who determined value, the judges who settled disputes. Over the following 12 years, he had quietly and methodically purchased, persuaded, or pressured his way into influence over all of those mechanisms in Millhaven County. He didn't need to own everything. He just needed to control the points where ownership was decided. A favorable assessor here, a bank officer whose gambling debts he held there, a county recorder who had a secret that Crow kept carefully in reserve. The architecture of his power was largely invisible precisely because none of its individual components looked like power. They looked like ordinary business relationships in an ordinary frontier county. "And Thomas?" Edith said when Caleb paused. Her voice was level. She had decided to be level. "Tell me about Thomas." Caleb looked at her steadily. "My investigator's name is Frank Aldred," he said. "He's been working this case for 2 years. What he's found about Thomas is, it's not certain yet. I want to be careful about what I tell you because I don't want to give you something I can't yet prove." "Tell me what you suspect," she said. "I can tell the difference between a suspicion and a fact." Another pause. Longer. Then, "The physician who signed Thomas's death certificate was a man named Greer. He signed 4 death certificates in the past 6 years for people who had something Crow wanted: land, a business, a key piece of property. In every case, the death was attributed to natural causes, and in every case, Crow or his instruments acquired the relevant property within 60 days. He kept his eyes on hers. Aldred has found 2 witnesses who saw Greer at the Halverson Bank the week before Thomas died. One of them will talk. The other one is afraid." The lamp flickered between them. Edith kept her hands flat on the table, the same instinct she'd had in the market, the same refusal to flinch, and breathed through what he'd just told her. She breathed through it like weather, like something that was passing over her and could not be stopped but could be survived. "I want to see everything Aldred has found," she said. "Edith, I'm not asking for your protection, Caleb. I'm asking for the truth that belongs to me." Her voice was quiet and absolutely firm. "Thomas was my husband. Whatever was done to him was done to me. I have the right to carry that." The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of 2 people at the same crossroads, reading the same map. "Yes," he said, "you do." He went to the East Building that night and came back with a leather folder thick with papers, and they sat at the kitchen table until well past midnight, going through it together. And by the time Edith finally went to bed, she was carrying something heavier than she had been that morning. But she was carrying it upright. That was the difference. She had been carrying grief and confusion and a nameless sense of wrongness for 2 years. Now she was carrying knowledge, and knowledge, however terrible, had a shape you could work with. Knowledge had edges you could hold. She slept 4 hours. When she woke, she had made a decision. The Millhaven Courthouse was a 2-story sandstone building on the north end of the main street, its facade rendered slightly grandiose by a pair of columns that the original builder had added, Edith suspected, in the hope that ambition might substitute for actual authority. The Land Records Office was on the 1st floor, second door on the right, staffed by a thin man named Purcell, who had the eyes of someone who had spent 20 years looking at documents and had decided that documents were considerably more trustworthy than the people who filed them. Edith walked in on a Thursday morning with Caleb beside her and a leather satchel in her hand and asked, in a voice that carried clearly into the hallway, to see the original deed records for the Barrett Bakery property and the 3 parcels directly adjacent to it. Purcell looked at her over his spectacles. He looked at Caleb. He looked at the satchel. "Those records are available for public inspection," he said carefully, in a tone that suggested he was reminding himself of this as much as he was informing them. "Wonderful," Edith said pleasantly. "Then we'd like to inspect them." What they found in those records, cross-referenced against the documents Aldred had compiled and the copies Margaret Mercer had made before her death, took 3 hours to assemble into a coherent picture. Purcell hovered, increasingly uncomfortable, as Edith and Caleb worked through the ledgers with a systematic efficiency that left no room for interruption. The scheme was not complicated as schemes went. It was actually rather elegant in its simplicity, which was perhaps why it had worked for as long as it had. The original land grants in the corridor Crow wanted had been filed with one set of boundaries. The subsequent deed transfers, the ones that had happened after suspicious deaths or forced foreclosures, had been filed with slightly altered boundaries, errors small enough to be attributed to clerical imprecision, but cumulative enough over multiple transactions to effectively steal property from one parcel and add it to another. The surveying records that would have revealed the discrepancies had been, in 3 cases, refiled with subtle but decisive amendments. It was the kind of fraud that required cooperation from inside the county recorder's office, which meant Purcell either knew about it or knew someone who did. When Edith set a copy of the original Barrett deed next to the bank's current claim document and pointed, without comment, to a boundary description that had changed by 40 feet in the recopine, Purcell went the color of old paper. "I'll need to verify," he started. "Please do," Edith said. She sat back in her chair and folded her hands in her lap. "We'll wait." Caleb said nothing. He had been saying very little all morning, she'd noticed, not because he was deferring to her, but because he seemed to understand with an instinct that she was coming to recognize as characteristic of him, when his presence was useful and when her voice was the instrument the moment required. Purcell verified. He did not speak for a very long time afterward. "I didn't know the full extent of it," he said finally, in a voice that had lost most of its professional architecture. "But you knew something," Edith said. He looked at his hands. "A man came to me 5 years ago," he said. Said the recorder's office had been making certain errors. Said those errors had been noted and would continue to be overlooked as long as I continued to be cooperative about record requests. His Adam's apple moved. He didn't threaten me directly. He didn't need to. He told me about what had happened to a records keeper in Garvey County who had been uncooperative. The man died in a fire. "Who came to you?" Caleb asked. His voice was quiet and without inflection. Purcell looked at him. "Wade Deaver," he said. The name hung in the air between them like smoke. Edith looked at Caleb. He was already looking at her. "We're going to need you to say that in writing," she said to Purcell, "and we're going to need you to be willing to say it in court." "If I do that." "If you don't," she said, "you're an accessory to fraud, to the theft of property from at least 9 families in this county, and possibly to things considerably worse than that." She kept her voice even. She was not threatening him. She was simply stating the landscape as it existed. "I understand that you're afraid. I understand that what you're being asked to do feels like stepping into the path of something very large. But you have been complicit in destroying people's lives, Mr. Purcell, and that has a weight to it that doesn't go away on its own." The room was very quiet. "I have a family," he said. "So did the people whose deeds were altered," she said. "So did my husband." Something in his face shifted. Cracked was perhaps more accurate, and she thought she saw in it the particular expression of a man who has been balancing something too heavy for too long and has just run out of the ability to keep balancing. "I'll write it down," he said. They left the courthouse 2 hours later, Purcell's signed statement in the leather satchel alongside the certified copies of the original deed records. The sun was at its midday height, blasting the street white, and the few people who saw them emerge looked quickly away in the manner of people who had learned to look away when certain things were happening in Millhaven. Edith stood on the top step and breathed the hot, dry air and let the weight of the morning settle through her. "That's the first piece," Caleb said beside her. "How many pieces do we need?" "Enough that a judge can't ignore it and Crow can't buy his way out of it." He looked at her. "Aldred thinks we're close. The 2 witnesses who saw Greer at the bank, if we can get the reluctant one to speak." "I want to talk to them," she said. He looked at her steadily. "That could put you at risk." "I've been at risk since Thomas died," she said. "I just didn't know it." She picked up her satchel. "Set it up with Aldred. I want to meet the witnesses." He nodded. And then after a moment, in a tone that was simply informational, "You were extraordinary in there." She looked at him. He wasn't sure what she'd expected him to say, but it wasn't that. Not the word extraordinary, which he said without embellishment, without the softening or qualifying that men of this era usually applied when they complimented women on capabilities they'd found surprising. He said it the way he'd say the mare had run well, as an observation of a fact that had been demonstrated and noted. "I was angry," she said. "I know," he said, angry and precise. That's a rare combination. She looked down the main street of Millhaven, the street where she'd stood with 11 pies and a busted dignity and not a single person who would stand up. And she felt something that was neither satisfaction nor triumph, but somewhere between the two, something quieter and more durable than either. Caleb, she said, when we file the formal complaint, the full one, the one with all of it, I want to file it myself. He turned to look at her. I know that you've been building this case for 4 years, she said. I know it was Margaret who started it, and I know what it has cost you to continue it, and I am not trying to take that from you. But Crow chose to come after my bakery. He chose to have my husband. She stopped, pressed through the catch in her voice, continued. He chose to make this visible by coming after me. And I think that means I need to be the one who stands in that courtroom and says, enough. Caleb was quiet for a long moment. Yes, he said. There was something in his voice she couldn't entirely name, not pride exactly, and not relief, though it held elements of both. Something older than those things, something that sounded like recognition. That's exactly right. They walked back to where the horses were tied. Around them, Millhaven went about its afternoon business, unaware that the machinery of its longest-running lie had just begun, in a records office on the north end of the main street, to visibly come apart. But word moved fast in a small town. By the time Edith and Caleb had ridden 3 miles east on the road toward the ranch, Wade Deaver was already standing in Gideon Crow's office, hat in hand, explaining what had happened in the courthouse that morning. And Gideon Crow, a man in his early 60s who had the appearance of a prosperous grandfather and the interior architecture of something considerably colder, sat behind his desk and listened, and then said, very quietly, the words that set the final chapter of this story in motion. Then we have no more time for patience, he said. Finish it. Deaver nodded, resettled his hat, and walked out. And in the east building of a ranch 6 miles outside of town, in the room that smelled of old paper and cedar oil and the accumulated intention of a woman who had died with her pen on her desk, the green journal lay open on the table where Edith had left it that morning, its last written pages facing the window, as though Margaret Mercer had set it there deliberately, as though she had understood, in the way that people who work toward something long enough sometimes understand, that the right person would eventually come and read what she had written, and would know what to do with it. The false accusations arrived before breakfast. Edith was at the range when Clara came in from the yard with the look on her face that had become, over the past weeks, a kind of shorthand between them. The look that meant something had happened, and it was not good and it required immediate attention. Clara set a folded newspaper on the counter beside the coffee pot without a word and stepped back. The Millhaven Courier ran twice a week. This was not a regular issue. Someone had paid for a special printing. Edith could tell by the paper stock, cheaper than the Courier's usual, the kind used for broadsides and announcements. And the single page carried, in large type above a column of smaller text, the headline, Barrett Widow Attempts Fraudulent Land Claim. Documents forged. Sources say. Edith read it once through without stopping. Then she set it on the counter, poured her coffee, and read it again. The column cited no named sources. It attributed to Edith a scheme to fabricate deed irregularities in the county records in order to avoid a legitimate foreclosure, framing everything she had done in the courthouse with Caleb and Purcell as the opening move of a fraud rather than the exposure of one. It described her as a woman of unstable temperament and questionable reputation whose late husband had left significant undisclosed debts. It referred in a single sentence of careful implication to her relationship with Caleb Mercer in a way that required no explicit accusation to be devastating in a town like Millhaven. She was still reading when Caleb came through the back door. He saw the broadside on the counter. He picked it up. He read it standing, and she watched his jaw tighten once and then deliberately loosen. The same controlled recalibration she had seen in him before. The internal discipline of a man who had learned not to give his reactions to people who would use them against him. This is Crow, he said. Of course it's Crow. She poured a second cup and set it on the table for him. He's trying to discredit me before the formal complaint is filed. If the town believes I'm the fraudulent party, then whatever I bring to court arrives already tainted. He's also trying to frighten Purcell into retracting, Caleb said. He sat, and she noticed that he did not sit with the heaviness of a man discouraged. He sat with the sharpness of a man recalculating. We need to file before he has time to pressure anyone else. The formal complaint has to be in front of Judge Beaumont's circuit before the end of the week." "Then we file today," Edith said. He looked at her. "Today is Tuesday. Beaumont doesn't reach the circuit until Friday. Then we file with the territorial office directly and request emergency consideration." She wrapped both hands around her cup. "Caleb, every day we wait is a day he uses to build the wall higher. We don't wait." He was quiet for a moment, and in that quiet she could see him running through the legal architecture of it, checking load-bearing walls, testing the structure. Then, "Aldred needs to be here by noon, and we need the second witness, the reluctant one. Without corroborating testimony on Greer, the death certificate argument is circumstantial." "I'll go," she said. "Edith, bun, I'll go." She looked at him steadily. "You told me the man's name is Hobart. He runs the feed store in Calvert Crossing. You said he's afraid. Afraid men don't respond to investigators and attorneys, Caleb. They respond to people who are also afraid and doing it anyway." She stood and untied her apron and tied it again with the decisive motion of someone preparing for something specific. "Let me go talk to him." He looked at her for a long moment with the expression that she had come to recognize as his version of yielding. Not defeat, not even agreement exactly, but the acknowledgement that someone else's judgment was correct and that fighting it would be the smaller choice. "Take Robbie with you," he said. "Done," she said. She was on the road to Calvert Crossing within the hour. Hobart's feed store occupied the corner of the main street in Calvert Crossing, a town smaller than Millhaven by half, the kind of place that existed primarily as a waypoint, a stop for water and supplies between somewhere and somewhere else. The store itself was well maintained, its window display orderly, which told Edith something about the man before she met him. Whatever fear had kept him silent, it had not collapsed him. He was still a man trying to keep things in order. He was 50-something, with a broad, weathered face and the particular wariness of someone who has been waiting for a particular knock on the door for a very long time and has never quite gotten used to the waiting. When Edith walked in, he looked at her once, and she saw the recognition move across his face. He knew who she was, which meant word of the broadside had already traveled this far, which meant Crow had distributed it widely and deliberately. "Mrs. Barrett," he said, in a voice carefully neutral. "Mr. Hobart." She did not approach the counter. She stood in the center of the store floor, where the light from the front window fell clearly, and she looked at him directly. "I'm not here to pressure you. I want you to know that before anything else. I'm here because I think you've been carrying something for a long time, and I'd like to give you the chance to set it down." He looked at the door behind her, then back. "I don't know what you think I can tell you." "I think you can tell me about the week before my husband died," she said quietly. "I think you saw something at the Halverson Bank that has been sitting in your chest like a stone for 2 years. She paused. "I know what it feels like to carry something you can't put down. I've been carrying Thomas for 2 years myself. Not just the grief, but the wrongness of it. The knowledge that something happened that no one will say out loud." Hobart said nothing, but his hands had gone still on the counter in a way that told her she had found the right place to press. "There is a woman named Margaret Mercer," she said, and she used the present tense deliberately because Margaret's work was still present, still alive, still operative in the world, even if Margaret herself was not. She spent 4 years documenting what Gideon Crow has done to people in this territory. She built a case that tells the truth about your neighbors and your community. And she died before she could carry it into a courtroom. Edith took one step forward. "I am going to carry it. I am going to stand in that courthouse in Millhaven, and I am going to say every word of what is true, with you or without you." Another step. "But I would rather do it with you, because you were there, and the truth needs the people who were present to stand behind it." The feed store was very quiet. Outside, a wagon rolled past. A dog barked once and was silent. "Greer came to the bank," Hobart said. His voice was barely above a whisper. "The week before your husband died. I was there to discuss my own loan terms. I had a late payment. There was a meeting. I was waiting in the hall outside Halverson's office, and Greer came through. I heard him talking to Halverson, not all of it. The door was mostly closed, but I heard enough." He stopped. "What did you hear?" Edith asked. He looked at her with an expression of profound, exhausted relief. The face of a man who has been holding a door shut against pressure from the other side and has finally been given permission to let go. "I heard Halverson say the Barrett property," he said, "and I heard Greer say it would be done cleanly. That's the word he used, cleanly." His jaw worked. 3 days later, your husband was dead. The air in the room had a quality she couldn't name, something solemn, something irrevocable. Edith kept her face still and her breathing even, and she nodded once. "Will you write that down and sign it?" she asked. "If I do," he said, "Crow will know it was me." "Yes," she said, "he will." "Then why would I—" "Because it's true," she said, "and because you know what happens to a place where the truth can never be said out loud. You're living in it right now." She held his gaze. "And because I think the weight of it is heavier than the fear. I think you already know that. Otherwise you wouldn't have opened the door when you saw me come in." Hobart was quiet for a very long time. Then he reached under the counter and produced a sheet of paper and a pen and set them down. "Tell me how to write it," he said. They filed the formal complaint on Thursday afternoon, one day ahead of Judge Beaumont's arrival on the circuit. Frank Aldred, a compact, methodical man of 40, whose face gave away nothing but whose eyes catalogued everything, had arrived at the ranch on Tuesday evening with 2 additional witness statements they hadn't expected. A former Halverson bank teller who had kept copies of altered loan documents, and a surveyor who had been hired to correct a boundary discrepancy and had been quietly paid 2 years ago to bury his correction report. The complaint was 47 pages. Edith and Caleb and Aldred had worked through Wednesday night to finish it, the 3 of them at the kitchen table with Margaret's journals and the certified deed copies and Purcell's statement and Hobart's statement and the new evidence arranged before them in overlapping layers, building the document the way you build a bridge, from both ends toward the middle, checking each span before extending the next one. At 3 in the morning, Caleb had looked up from the section he was reviewing and said, without particular drama, "It's enough." "You're sure?" Aldred had said. "It was enough 2 months ago," he said. "We have more than enough." He looked at Edith. "Are you ready?" She had been staring at the last page. The signature line. Her name, printed below it, waiting. Edith Marie Barrett, complainant. "I've been ready," she said, "for 2 years." She signed it. The pen moved across the page with a steadiness that she felt not in her hand but somewhere deeper, somewhere below the level of resolve, in the place where things had simply and finally become certain. The next morning, she carried the complaint into the territorial filing office herself, with Caleb 1 step behind her and Aldred beside her and the leather satchel in her hand, and she slid it across the counter to the filing clerk, a young man who looked at the document's thickness with wide eyes and then looked at her face and made no comment at all. And she said, "For Judge Beaumont's consideration, emergency basis, the grounds are outlined on page 3. The clerk stamped it. The stamp came down hard and clean and final, like a period at the end of a very long sentence. That same night, they came for the evidence. Caleb had anticipated it. He had said so, 2 days before, in a way that was not prediction so much as simple probability assessment. Once the filing is confirmed, he'll make one more move on the physical evidence. He can't unfile the complaint, but if he can discredit or destroy the documents we've cited as exhibits, he can create enough doubt to delay." He had not told Edith exactly what preparations he'd made. She had not asked, because she had learned over the weeks at the ranch the difference between needing to know something and needing to trust someone. She trusted him. That was not a small thing for her to say about anyone. She was in her room when she heard it, past midnight, the ranch in deep quiet, and then from the east side of the property, a sound that was not wind and not animals. Her boots were on before she was fully awake. She was in the hallway when she nearly walked into Clara, who was already dressed, a lamp in one hand and a very practical-looking iron poker in the other. "East Building," Clara said. "I know," Edith said. They were not the first there. Caleb was already outside, moving through the dark with a sureness that told her he had been awake, perhaps had not slept at all. Robbie was at the east side of the barn with a rifle carried correctly and an expression of controlled alarm. 2 other ranch hands whose names Edith was still learning had taken positions on either side of the East Building's single door. 3 men had come over the fence. She could see them in the yard light from the main house, 2 of them now backed against the East Building's wall, and 1 on the ground. Caleb's hand on his collar, the man on his knees in the dirt looking at the ground, with the particular posture of someone whose confidence had left him very recently. "Where's the third?" Edith heard Caleb say. "Gone," Robbie said from the barn. Ran when he saw the lights. Caleb looked at the man on the ground. "Who sent you?" The man said nothing. "You're on private property at midnight with a pair of bolt cutters," Caleb said, with the same unhurried calm he brought to everything. "That's breaking and entering under territorial law. The man who ran is gone, and the man standing against that wall is going to tell me something useful in about 30 seconds, which means your window for being the person who cooperates first is closing." He paused. "Who sent you?" Still nothing. Edith walked past Caleb to the door of the east building and tried it. The bolt held. They had replaced the lock 3 days ago, a heavy mechanism that would have taken the bolt cutters considerable time even if they'd gotten to it uninterrupted. She turned back to the yard. "The documents are fine," she said. The man against the wall made a sound that wasn't quite a word. "What was that?" she asked. He looked at her, and she recognized him, belatedly. One of Deaver's riders, the one who had stood laughing behind Deaver at the market the morning her pies were destroyed. He looked now considerably less confident than he had that morning in August. Caught on someone else's property in the dark, had a way of rearranging a man's sense of his own position. "Deaver said," he started, and then stopped. "Deaver said what?" Caleb asked. The rider looked between them. He was doing arithmetic, the visible kind, calculating what telling them cost against what it bought against what Deaver would do if he found out. The arithmetic clearly did not resolve in Deaver's favor, because after a moment the man exhaled and said, "Deaver said Crow wanted the green journal and the folder with the deed copies, said without those the rest of it falls apart." The green journal. Margaret's journal. Edith looked at Caleb. He was looking at her with an expression she could read now with the fluency of weeks of close attention. He was telling her without words that this confirmed something he had already believed, and that she should know that the journal was safe. "Where is it?" she asked him quietly. "Filed with the territorial court yesterday as Exhibit A," he said, just as quietly. "A certified copy is in the East Building. The original is out of reach." Something in his face when he said out of reach was almost, not quite, but almost, satisfied. They were in the courtroom on Friday morning when Judge Arthur Beaumont arrived on the circuit. Beaumont was not what Edith had expected, though she realized afterward that she hadn't known what she'd expected. Perhaps someone more obviously formidable, some physical expression of judicial authority. What she got was a compact man of 65 with a gray beard trimmed to a precise line and eyes of a very clear pale blue that moved across a room with the comprehensive efficiency of a man who had spent decades watching people attempt to deceive him and had gotten very good at seeing the attempt before it fully formed. He read the complaint in his chambers before the hearing. They waited in the corridor, Edith and Caleb and Aldred, in a silence that was not empty but suspended, like a breath held before something important. When the door opened and the clerk beckoned them in, Beaumont was sitting behind his desk with the complaint in front of him and his fingertips pressed together, and he looked at Edith the way she imagined a geologist looked at an unexpected stratum, with interest that was professional first and personal second, but genuine either way. "Mrs. Barrett," he said, "you understand that filing a complaint of this scope against a private citizen requires the evidence to be substantial and the complainant's credibility to be unimpeachable." "I do," she said. "Are you prepared to testify to the contents of this document under oath?" "I am." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the complaint again. "I'm going to need 3 days to review the exhibits," he said. "I'll set the preliminary hearing for Monday. In the meantime," he looked at Aldred, "the physical exhibits are secured?" "Filed and sealed yesterday," Aldred said. Beaumont nodded. He looked at Edith once more, with the clear, pale eyes. "The broadside that circulated this week," he said. It was not a question. "Crow's printing," Caleb said. "I assumed as much." Beaumont picked up his pen. "I've been watching Gideon Crow's activities in this territory for 3 years, Mrs. Barrett. I ruled against one of his water claims in 1880 and have been waiting with imperfect patience for someone to bring me something I could actually use." He looked at the complaint's 47 pages. "This," he said, with the measured understatement of a man who did not permit himself enthusiasm, "is something I can use." He began writing. They understood they were dismissed. In the corridor outside, Aldred permitted himself a small, controlled exhale that was the closest Edith had seen him come to visible emotion. Caleb was looking at the floor, his hat in his hands, and she thought she saw something move through his shoulders, a release of something that had been held there for a very long time. She said nothing. She put her hand on the leather satchel and stood in the sandstone corridor of the Millhaven courthouse while the morning light came through the end window and lay in a long rectangle across the floor. And she thought of Thomas at his work table on an evening in 1878, painting the bakery sign with a child's brush, the tip of his tongue at the corner of his mouth in concentration. She thought of Margaret Mercer's pen moving across green-covered pages in the dark, building the architecture of a truth she did not live to deliver. She thought of 11 peach pies in the August sun. No honest work should end in humiliation. She looked at Caleb, who was looking at her. "Monday," she said. "Monday," he said. And the word between them was not an ending, but a threshold. The last door before the room where everything that had been done in darkness would finally be required to stand in the light and account for itself. Outside, Millhaven went about its Friday business, and Gideon Crow sat in his office above the bank and read the notification of the scheduled hearing that his lawyer had just delivered. And for the first time in 11 years, the particular stillness behind his eyes was not confidence. It was something that had not yet fully formed into fear, but was moving in that direction. And Wade Deaver, standing in the corner of that office, with his hat in his hands, and the news of last night's failed raid still fresh between them, watched his employer's face and understood, with the instinct of a man whose livelihood had always depended on reading which way a thing was going to fall, that the ground beneath everything he had built his life on had begun, quietly and without announcement, to shift. The weekend before the Monday hearing was the longest of Edith's life. Not because she was idle, she was never idle, and the ranch kitchen had its own demands that did not pause for pending litigation, or the particular anxiety of a woman who had set something enormous in motion and now had to wait for it to land. She baked, she organized, she went through the supply stores with Clara on Saturday morning and took inventory with the methodical attention of someone who needed her hands engaged while her mind worked through what was coming. But underneath everything, underneath the bread rising and the coffee boiling and Patch's small, serious voice asking her questions about pie, the awareness of Monday sat in her chest like a struck bell, still vibrating, the sound of it present in everything. Caleb found her Saturday evening sitting on the back steps with a cup of coffee gone cold, looking out at the flat Texas dark where the stars had come out in their full summer abundance, thick and indifferent and very far away. He sat down beside her without asking, leaving a foot of space between them, and was quiet in the way he was always quiet. Not absent, not pressuring, just present, bringing the particular quality of attention he gave to everything that mattered. "Tell me what you're afraid of," he said, after a while. She thought about deflecting. She was good at deflecting. She had spent 2 years building efficient structures for managing what she felt so that it didn't interfere with what she had to do. But she was tired of those structures, and he was asking directly, and she had learned by now that directness with Caleb Mercer was the only currency that worked. "That I'll stand up in that courtroom," she said, "and all of it will be true. Every document, every witness, everything, and it still won't be enough. That money and power will simply outlast evidence the way they always have." She looked at her cold coffee. "That Thomas will stay unavenged because the machinery that killed him is the same machinery that decides whether he was killed." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "That's a real fear," he said. "I won't tell you it isn't. I know you won't. What I will tell you," he said, "is that Beaumont is not Halverson and not Crow's. I have watched that man operate for 3 years. He ruled against Crow once when it cost him something, when Crow's people made it uncomfortable for him, and he ruled against them anyway, because the law said to." He paused. "There are not many men like that. He is one of them." She turned to look at him, and in the dark and the starlight his face had a quality she hadn't quite seen in it before. Open, somehow, in a way that the daytime version of him held more carefully. "You've been waiting for this for 4 years," she said, "since before I arrived, since Margaret." She held his gaze. "How have you done it? Carried it that long without breaking?" He looked at the dark for a long moment. "Margaret used to say that patience isn't the absence of urgency," he said. "It's the decision to put the urgency somewhere useful." He was quiet. After she died, I didn't know for a long time what useful meant anymore. The work continued because stopping felt like betraying her. And then he stopped. And then, she said. He looked at her. Something in his expression was the most unguarded she had ever seen it. Not raw, not exposed, but present in a way that cost him something to allow. And then a woman walked into the Millhaven market with 11 peach pies, he said, and stood with her hands flat on a table while Wade Deaver tried to humiliate her in front of half the town and didn't give him an inch. The faintest trace of something crossed his face, not quite a smile, but the possibility of one. I understood what useful meant again. The night insects sang in the grass. The stars burned above the flat land. Caleb, she said, and stopped. I know, he said quietly. One thing at a time. She nodded. She picked up her cold coffee and drank it anyway, because waste was waste and the night was long. And beside her, Caleb Mercer sat in the dark with the patience of a man who had learned, at considerable cost, that the things worth waiting for were worth waiting for correctly. Monday came with a flat white sky and a dry wind from the west that coated everything in a fine layer of dust by the time Edith rode into Millhaven at 8 in the morning. What she had not expected was the people. The street outside the courthouse was not empty. It was not, in fact, anywhere near empty. There were perhaps 60 people gathered in loose clusters along the sidewalk and the courthouse steps. Not a crowd exactly, not organized, but present in the deliberate way of people who have decided that a thing happening nearby is a thing they need to witness. She recognized faces. Marta Engel from the dress shop, who had put down her pie at the market without meeting her eyes, now standing at the base of the steps with her hands clasped. The widow Castellano, who had bought a pie with her eyes bright and fierce. Old Agnes Pruitt, pipe in hand, in the second row with the expression of someone who had known something was coming and had dressed appropriately. She did not allow herself to feel the significance of it yet. There was work to do first. Inside the courtroom, the air was the particular thick warmth of a small official space that too many people had crammed into on a warm morning. Every seat in the gallery was taken. At the complainant's table, Aldred was already seated, his documents in their meticulous order before him. Caleb was at her shoulder. At the respondent's table across the aisle, Gideon Crow sat with 2 attorneys in good suits, and Edith looked at him for the first time at close range. She had seen him before, in the way you saw powerful men in small towns. At a distance, attended, the center of gravitational pull that made other people orbit carefully around him. Up close, he was smaller than she'd expected. Not physically small. He was a large man, broad and well-fed, with white hair combed to a careful side part, and the clothes of someone who thought about what his appearance communicated. But there was something diminished about him that she couldn't quite locate at first, and then she understood what it was. He was afraid. Not visibly, not to someone who wasn't looking, but she was looking, and she could see it in the set of his jaw. The tightness that was not authority, but its imitation. And in the way his eyes moved to the gallery and then away, calculating the room rather than commanding it. He was afraid because he had run out of moves. The evidence was filed and sealed. The witnesses were here. The men he'd sent to the ranch had been held overnight by Caleb and were now in the county sheriff's custody on trespassing charges that Aldred had filed Saturday morning. Purcell had not retracted. Hobart had not retracted. And Wade Deaver, who had, at some point over the weekend, evidently performed his own calculation of the mathematics of loyalty and found that Crow's side of the ledger was coming up short, was not in the room. His absence was louder than his presence would have been. Judge Beaumont entered at 9 o'clock precisely, and the room came to its feet and then settled, and the hearing began. Edith had anticipated a long morning of procedural maneuvering. Crow's attorneys were expensive and would use every available instrument of delay and objection. What she had not anticipated was how quickly the structure of Crow's defense would begin to reveal its own hollowness once the documents were in the room. Crow's lead attorney, a man named Fitch, who had the polished aggression of someone paid to be unpleasant on behalf of others, challenged the admissibility of the deed copies, the reliability of Purcell's statement, the legal standing of the complaint itself. Beaumont listened to each objection with the clear, pale attention he brought to everything and overruled them with a precision that left no room for re-argument. Then Caleb was called to present the documentary evidence. He stood at the front of the room with 4 years of accumulated work in a leather portfolio and presented it the way he did most things, without performance, without flourish, with the quiet authority of someone who had lived with the details long enough that they had become simply the shape of the truth. He walked through the deed discrepancies page by page, cross-referencing Margaret's documented observations with the certified records and the surveyor's buried correction report, building the picture with an accretion of specificity that left no convenient gap for doubt to occupy. Fitch objected 17 times. Beaumont sustained 2 of them, both on minor procedural grounds that changed nothing material. The other 15 he dismissed with decreasing patience. Then Edith was called. She walked to the front of the courtroom and stood, and the room was very quiet, and she was aware of it in the same way she had been aware of the market crowd in August, the weight of collective attention, the particular pressure of many eyes, and she did what she had done then. She kept her hands still. She breathed. She found her footing. She told the truth. She told it in the order it had happened. The foreclosure notice, the market, the ranch, the journals, the courthouse with Purcell, the contaminated stores, the wagon, the locked document room, and the night 3 men had come over the fence with bolt cutters. She told it without embellishment and without self-pity, and with the kind of plainness that was more devastating than eloquence because it had no seams, nothing for a skilled attorney to catch a fingernail in and pull. Then she set Thomas's letters on the table. There were 14 of them, business letters from the year before his death, written in the steady hand she'd copied for the market sign, dealing with routine matters of the bakery's operation, suppliers, orders, a loan payment, a property tax dispute with the county assessor's office. In that last category, the property tax dispute, Thomas had written, 3 months before he died, to the assessor directly and cited an irregularity in the boundary description of the bakery parcel. The irregularity that Edith and Caleb had found in the courthouse records. The irregularity that someone had subsequently amended to conceal. Thomas had seen it first. He had tried to correct it through legitimate channels. And 6 weeks after writing that letter, he was dead. Fitch objected to the letter's admissibility. Beaumont looked at the letters, looked at Fitch, and said, "Overruled." Hobart testified. His voice shook at the beginning and steadied as he spoke. And by the time he finished, he was looking directly at Gideon Crow across the courtroom, with an expression that had shed its fear the way a tree sheds dead bark, not violently, but because it had become unnecessary. Purcell testified. The former bank teller testified. The surveyor testified. And then, at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, when Fitch was in the middle of his argument that the totality of the evidence constituted nothing more than circumstantial inference, the door at the back of the courtroom opened. Wade Deaver walked in. He was not attended. He was not wearing his authority like a second coat. He was wearing the face of a man who had spent the weekend making a decision that he understood would cost him everything he had built in Millhaven and had decided, for reasons perhaps he could not himself fully articulate, to make it anyway. He walked down the center aisle with the even step of someone who has run out of alternative routes and has accepted, finally, the only road left. He was sworn in. Beaumont looked at him with the clear, pale eyes. "Mr. Deaver," Beaumont said. "You are appearing voluntarily?" "Yes, sir." "You understand you may be incriminating yourself in the course of your testimony?" "Yes, sir." "Proceed." What Wade Deaver said in the next 40 minutes dismantled the remaining structure of Gideon Crow's defense with the thoroughness of a man who had spent 11 years as the instrument of that defense and knew exactly where every load-bearing wall was. He named the properties targeted and the methods used to target them. He named the officials who had received payments. He described, with a flatness that made it more terrible than theatrics would have, the conversation in which Crow had directed him to publicly humiliate Edith Barrett at the market, to make an example, to intimidate other landowners who were beginning to ask questions. He described what he knew, secondhand from Crow's own lips, about the arrangement with Dr. Greer. When he said Thomas Barrett's name, the gallery made a sound, not loud, barely audible, but present, a collective intake of breath that was also a kind of acknowledgement. The town hearing out loud what some of them had half known or suspected or refused to look at directly. Edith sat at the complainant's table and kept her hands flat on its surface and breathed through it. Caleb, beside her, did not touch her hand or speak. He was simply there, solid and certain and close, and that was exactly enough. Fitch declined to cross-examine Deaver. Beaumont called a recess of 30 minutes. When he returned to the bench, his expression had not changed. It was the same comprehensive, unhurried attention, but there was something in his posture that had shifted, something that suggested a man who had waited a long time for a particular thing and was now in the presence of it. "I am finding sufficient cause," he said, "to immediately halt the foreclosure proceedings on the Barrett Bakery property, pending full review. I am referring the matter of fraudulent deed alterations to the Territorial Attorney's Office for criminal investigation. I am ordering an immediate independent audit of all property transactions in Millhaven County for the past 12 years. He looked at Crow's table. "Mr. Crow, you will surrender your passport to the court. You are not to leave the territory." He looked at the room. "I am additionally referring the matter of Dr. Greer's death certificates to the Territorial Medical Board and the Attorney's Office. Any individuals named in the testimony today who have not yet made voluntary statements are advised to do so promptly." He set down his pen. "Court is in recess." The gavel came down. The sound it made was not loud, but in the quiet of the courtroom, in the particular quality of the silence that followed it, it sounded to Edith Barrett like something ending and something else, simultaneously beginning. The federal investigation that expanded from Beaumont's referral took 4 months to complete. Gideon Crow was indicted on 11 counts, including fraud, conspiracy, and, when the investigation into Dr. Greer produced a witness who had not come forward before, a nurse who had worked in Greer's office and kept her own records, a charge more serious than any of the property crimes. He was convicted on 9 of 11 counts in the spring of 1884. He went to prison. Halverson's bank was placed in receivership and its assets dispersed to creditors, which included, among others, the families of 8 landowners whose properties had been illegally seized. Wade Deaver, in exchange for his testimony, received a reduced sentence on conspiracy charges and served 2 years. Dr. Greer left the territory the week after the hearing and was found, 2 months later, in a town in New Mexico where he had established a new practice under a different name. He did not escape what he had done. The Barrett Bakery foreclosure was not merely halted. It was voided entirely, along with the underlying mortgage, which the court found to have been issued under fraudulent terms. Edith received, in addition to clear title to the property, a settlement from the receivership proceedings that was not a fortune but was enough. Enough to repair what needed repairing, enough to breathe, enough to build. She stood in the bakery on the morning she got her keys back and stood in the middle of it and looked at Thomas's oven and Thomas's sign and the stone counter he had laid by hand, and she allowed herself one long moment of grief that was also, inseparably, something else. Something that had been waiting underneath the grief for 2 years like a structure beneath floodwater, still standing, waiting for the water to recede so it could be seen again. She let herself feel it. Then she put on her apron. The reopening took 3 weeks of preparation and produced, when the doors finally opened on a Wednesday morning in early summer, a line that stretched to the corner of the block. Not all of them were there because they had been her supporters. She knew that. Some of them were there because the bakery story had made it famous in a way that tragedy and justice together create, and some of them were there simply because they had heard the bread was good. She did not hold the complicated ones at a distance. She sold them bread. Marta Engel came in the first day and bought 2 loaves and looked at Edith with an expression that held its own quiet accounting in it. Edith handed her the bread and said, "It's good to see you, Marta," and meant it without reservation, because the grace of not holding grudges was something she had decided on deliberately, the way she decided most things. Not because it was easy, but because it was right, and because the alternative was a closed fist where an open hand could be. Agnes Pruitt did not come in. She sent Patch, who had, in the way of small children, negotiated himself into a standing arrangement of sweeping the bakery floor on Saturday mornings in exchange for a paper of candy, with a note that said simply, "I knew you'd do it." A P. Edith put the note in her apron pocket and found it 3 days later, softened from washing, and put it in the box where she kept Thomas's letters. The transformation of the bakery into something larger came gradually, then all at once. The first change was practical. Clara and Nora began working in the bakery 2 days a week, not as charity, but as employees at fair wages, because the demand had outgrown what Edith could manage alone, and because Clara had turned out to have a gift for pastry that Edith recognized and refused to leave uncultivated. Within 6 months, young Jesse, whose facility with numbers had been wasted on ranch ledgers, was managing the bakery's accounts and had identified 3 opportunities for wholesale contracts with establishments in the next county that Edith had not had the bandwidth to pursue alone. The second change came when the woman who ran the boarding house on 2nd Street came to Edith in November with a problem. She was losing her lease and had no capital for a new arrangement. And Edith, without entirely planning to, found herself sitting at the kitchen table that had hosted so many consequential conversations working through the woman's finances and connections and possibilities until a workable path emerged. It was not so different, she found, from working out a complex recipe. You identified what you had, you understood what was missing, and you built the bridge between them. Word traveled the way it did in small places. Other women came. Not all of them needed the same thing. Some needed capital, some needed connection. Some needed simply a room at a table where someone would take their problems seriously and not tell them what they couldn't do. Edith gave them what she had, and what she had, she found, was more than she'd known. Not just the knowledge built from her own survival, but the network that had gathered around that survival. Caleb's contacts, Aldred's legal knowledge, Jesse's financial mind, Nora's hard-won understanding of how institutional charity differed from genuine assistance. By the end of 1884, what had started as a bakery was something that didn't yet have a name, but functioned as both a commercial enterprise and a practical infrastructure for women who needed one. The territorial newspaper, not the Millhaven Courier, which had printed Crow's broadside, but the larger territorial record, ran a piece on it in December that described Edith as a business leader of unusual scope and determination. She read the piece once, set it aside, and went back to work. Caleb came to her on a Sunday afternoon in late October, when the heat had finally broken and the air had the first knife edge of coming autumn in it, and found her on the back steps of the bakery. The same steps she'd sat on as a young wife watching Thomas carry flour sacks. The same steps she'd sat on alone in the dark, months after his death, eating an apple and reading a letter from Aldred about the final property restitutions. He sat beside her. He had, she noticed, his good coat on, which he wore when he was doing something deliberate. He turned his hat in his hands. "I'm not going to pretend," he said, "that I don't know what I want to say to you. I think you've known for a while what I want to say to you." She set down the letter. She looked at him. "Yes," she said. "I want to say it anyway," he said, "because I think you deserve to hear it said directly and not implied." He looked at her with the clear, storm-reading eyes that had found her across a Millhaven market on an August morning with 11 peach pies and a man about to destroy them. "I want to build the rest of it with you, not ahead of you, not behind you." A pause. "Beside you." She was quiet for a moment. The autumn air moved between them, carrying the smell of dry grass and the faint sweetness of the bakery behind them. And somewhere on the main street a wagon moved and a dog called out, and the world continued its ordinary motion around this particular extraordinary moment. "You know who I am now," she said. "Not the woman at the market. All of it. The stubbornness and the inability to accept help gracefully, and the way I hold a grudge against flour that doesn't behave correctly." "I know," he said, with the faint possibility of a smile. "Those are the parts I'm specifically interested in. I'm not the same woman I was when Thomas was alive," she said. It was important to her to say this. "I became something different, not less. I think not less, but different. And I'm not going to fold back into who I was to make the fit easier." "I'm not asking you to," he said simply. "Edith, I watched you build a legal case against one of the most powerful men in this territory and walk into a courtroom and dismantle him. I watched you stand in a market with your hands flat on a table and not give an inch." He set his hat down on the step between them. "I'm not interested in a smaller version of you. I would not know what to do with one." She looked at him for a long time, reading his face the way she'd learned to read it over months of close attention. The steadiness in it, the patience, the particular quality of honesty that he'd maintained in every exchange, including the ones where honesty had cost him something. Then she picked up her apple and took a bite and said, "Ask me properly." Something shifted in his face. And there it was. The thing she'd seen almost, but never quite. A real smile, full and unguarded, the expression of a man arriving somewhere he'd been working toward for a long time. He asked her properly. She said yes. The peach tree behind the old house bloomed the following spring with its usual extravagance, as though it had not been paying attention to anything that had happened beneath it and was simply continuing its own business of abundance. Edith picked the first basket herself on a Tuesday morning, climbing the ladder with the same steadiness she brought to everything. And when she came down, she stood in the yard for a moment with the basket against her hip, and the summer heat beginning and the sound of the bakery from the street, Clara's voice, and Jessie's laughter, and the bell on the door chiming as a customer went in. All of it layered together into a sound that was not Thomas and was not the past, but was something that had grown from that ground and could not have grown anywhere else or from anything other than what it had grown from. She carried the basket in. She put on her apron. She started the pies. There were 11 of them by the end of the morning, their lattice tops golden and steaming, the filling running just slightly at the edges the way it always did, the fruit trying to exceed its container, to overflow what held it. She stood back and looked at them. Then Caleb came through the back door with his sleeves rolled up and flour on his coat from where he'd leaned against the counter without thinking, and he looked at the pies and then at her, and he said, "Still perfect." She looked at him, then at the pies, then at the kitchen around her, the kitchen Thomas had built, that she had held on to through grief and fraud and legal warfare and every mechanism Gideon Crow had pointed at her life. And through the window, the street where she had stood with these same pies in the August heat of 1883 and been reminded by a stranger's simple act of decency that dignity was not a thing that could be taken, only surrendered. She had not surrendered it. She had instead walked through every fire they'd built for her and come out the other side holding something larger than what she'd carried in, not unburned, not unchanged, but intact in every way that mattered, and carrying with her the truth of what could be built when a person refused, consistently and at considerable cost, to become small. "They are," she said. She picked up her spatula. Outside, the summer of 1884 was bright and indifferent and entirely open, and Millhaven was a different place than it had been a year ago. And Edith Barrett, whose name now appeared in territorial papers as a business leader, a reformer, a woman of unusual scope, was ready for all of it. She had always been ready. It had simply taken the rest of the world a little while to catch up.